Hi there, welcome to the EDeology podcast, where we get to know the people behind today's eating disorder treatment landscape. In this first episode, I will explain what this podcast is, why I created it, and how future episodes will be structured. Who am I? My name is Elka Kubako. I am a licensed social worker, psychotherapist, yoga teacher, and myself have recovered from an eating disorder. My eating disorder recovery process is in some ways different in the sense that I was very secretive while I was struggling, never went to any treatment center, and recovered basically on my own by reading a lot of books and trying things out. Looking back, there were a lot of points in my recovery where I considered what I was doing part of my recovery, and mainstream eating disorder professionals would have said, like, this is really dysfunctional eating behavior. And in some ways, I wonder if had I been in a treatment center, maybe I would have recovered quicker. Maybe I would have had less ups and downs. And at the same time, I'm grateful to have been allowed to go through my own perspectives, my own process. And I don't like being told what to do. And now I'm at a place where I'm able to eat entirely intuitively and feel very much at peace with food and my body. And my process of getting there was different from what would have been considered legitimate in many eating disorder treatment centers. And this just strengthens or gives me the value for really being able to hold each individual person's experience, even if it differs from what are sort of mainstream clinical recommendations. Why did I create this podcast? I've been noticing, and I've heard from many people in this field who've been noticing a trend on social media, different platforms, different therapists, and especially eating disorder professional groups, where people will often post anonymously because they feel unsafe. Perhaps they've been attacked for a post they've had in the past. I've personally seen where a poster will share some sort of question or comment, and that is unpopular or digresses from the more popularized narrative around eating disorders. And there will immediately be sometimes over 100 comments attacking them, questioning their credibility, their identity, whether they themselves are fully recovered. I've seen people leave groups because of that, feeling attacked. And it makes sense that these topics are so emotionally charged. As a society, our relationship with food and body is fractured. So many people have been so deeply hurt by dominant cultural perspectives around what is the ideal body type, especially people in larger bodies. So it makes sense that it's difficult to have these conversations. It makes sense that if you hear somebody sharing something that has personally harmed you, you want to correct them. You don't want other people to experience the same pain that you did, and you want to make a change in the larger way that we as a collective see food and bodies. And like to this end, social media and virtual platforms make it so challenging because any social media post is essentially communication taken out of context. What do I mean by this? When somebody posts something on, let's say, Facebook or any other platform, we see the information they posted. We don't see what led them to those conclusions. What is their motivation in asking or posting? We don't know who they are as a person, who they are as a professional, how they show up in their office when they're office or treatment center when they're working with clients. We also don't see any of the more subtle forms of communication that let us know, like, there's another person here, I'm with you, we're in relationship. We don't we don't have eye contact. We don't see any other more subtle facial expressions or body language. So social media communication is communication taken out of context. Which context? The context of the humanity of the person speaking and the relationship between speaker and listener. What is this podcast? So this podcast is respectful conversations about controversial issues related to food, weight, health, and body image. In this podcast, rather than debating science, fact, or truth, we will share personal experiences. So when somebody presents with a particular perspective, viewpoint, or stand on a position, I'll ask them to share their personal experiences, what in their either their own recovery process, their professional life, if they're in academia, their research that has led them to these conclusions. So again, personal experience does not need to be, it can be your own recovery story. It can also be the way your own opinions and perspectives have evolved based on clinical or academic work. This podcast is unfiltered and uncensored. My goal is to include the diversity of political and the political and ideological spectrum. There is no opinion or perspective that I will shut out uh, because it doesn't fit into whatever guidelines or perspectives. If something doesn't land with you or is reminiscent of a hurtful message you've heard in the past, feel free to step away from that episode or reach out to me. We will have, so in this podcast, we will have two types of conversations. The first is story. So this means, again, where you'll share, or the speaker, the podcast guest, will share uh, their position on a particular issue, and then their personal or professional story that has led them to take up this position. So this brings the communication back in the context of the speaker's humanity. We're getting to know the person, even if we don't agree in the conclusions they came to, we can get to know what motivates them, who they are as people, what are the experiences that drive the position they've taken. And the second type of conversation is dialogue. And this conversation will be similar to story in the sense that we'll have people sharing their own experiences, feelings, reactions, and perspectives. And we'll have two people who take different standpoints on a topic that is meaningful to both of them, conversing and connecting through it. This will be dialogue, not debate. So debate is where we enter with the purpose of convincing either the other person or a larger audience of the truth of our own, the truth or logic or superiority of our own position. And debates are good ways of establishing who's either smarter, better than arguing, or louder. In some circles, they can be good ways of connecting to people. When we talk about dialogue, our goal is not to convince anyone of anything, but to establish a very human connection between two people who have different viewpoints. So the purpose of dialogue then is to bring conversation back in the context of relationship, where when we're talking to each other, we're connecting to each other. And this has become a very radical thing in our world today. It's a very painful and difficult thing to do and takes a lot of bravery and strength. And oftentimes when we encounter perspectives that we found hurtful, our gut level inclination is fight or flight. So we might argue with the person, or we might say like, this is just not somebody I can handle having contact with. And that's a valid decision and also a painful one. I've heard so many people who have lost relationships, lost even really old friendships over political differences. And I know from working with couples and family members that if this is a relationship we want to preserve and are willing to do the work, there is a space where sharing different experiences can actually bring us closer together. And this again requires that we share our personal, when we share, we're not trying to convince or change the other person, but sharing something of ourselves, which is really valuable. Podcast assumptions. So the core assumption of this podcast is that people are good. The people who come on here are motivated by a genuine desire to help other people, to make our society a kinder place for people in whatever types of bodies, with whatever types of food struggles. The people I am speaking to, I am assuming that they are effective professionals and they have legitimate reasons for reaching their own conclusions. I'm also assuming that each person is the expert on their own experience. It's not my job to judge if you're fully recovered, if you're fit to be a professional, how your identity affects your positions, and whether those ways are right or wrong, valid or invalid. You are the expert on your own experience. You can share how your own experiences have shaped your position. That is not my job. I'm also assuming that people have different needs. And this goes back to the well-worn statement that one man's poison can be another's medicine, one woman's medicine, another's poison. So somebody might find something very hurtful that was helpful to you, or vice versa. And it's natural that we all have different needs, and something can be really helpful to one person and really harmful to another. Each individual's experience is valid, but not generalizable. Valid, but not generalizable. Valid. So whatever your experience is, there are reasons you've experienced that way. And that experience and that position makes sense in the context of your life, your internal and external circumstances. It may not be generalizable. What worked for you might not work for me. It might not work for the larger eating disorder population, or for most of the larger eating disorder population. I might not bring it back to my office. Alongside that, I'm assuming that listeners are capable of filtering through information, holding on to what works for them, and discarding what doesn't. So again, it's not my job to filter. I don't have any guidelines for who can come onto this podcast, what opinions and perspectives are allowed. My goal is to allow everything, allow all opinions and perspectives, include as much diversity, ideological and political diversity as I can. And I'm relying on the listener to then be able to sort through and say, this is something that is helpful for me to listen to, and this is something that I'd rather not, or that I don't need in my life at this point. Another assumption is that the antidote to negatively impactful information is not censorship, but increased access to alternative perspectives, which is to say that if you encounter something on this podcast that you believe is harmful, or that has hurt you personally, hurt people you work with, rather than um, rather than attacking the person or asking that the episode be taken down, reach out to me. And if you're open to it, I would love to record another episode on the same topic, approaching it from your viewpoint, from the viewpoint of your experiences and perspectives. In this way, for listeners as well, when they hear a perspective, that perspective will be put in the context of all the other perspectives in the field, and they can choose what works for them. And the final assumption of this podcast is that the multitude of lived experience is as valid a way of learning as is reading scientific data-driven literature. In fact, the multitude of lived experience is implicitly included in scientific data, but often not recorded. What do I mean by this? Let's just take, for example, I often hear people saying that family-based treatment is the gold standard for treating eating disorders. Now, if we go back to the original studies done on family-based treatment, what does this actually mean? So you have studies comparing family-based treatment to either other types of treatment or a control group that consists of no treatment or treatment as usual. And then the results of the study will let us know what percentage of people in each group recovers. So I'm just going to make up numbers here because I don't have the study in front of me. But let's just say it said that 60% of people in the family-based treatment group recovered versus 30% in the control group. So the explicit story, or the story that is emphasized in the research findings, is that family-based treatment is superior to other treatments when treating adolescents with eating disorders. The other stories that are also included in the same study but de-emphasized are the story of the 40% in the FBT group and the 70% in the control group that did not recover. There's also the story of all the people who were excluded from the study because of significant comorbidities, maybe trauma history, abuse, or whatever the exclusion criteria of the study. In addition to that, if we were to zoom on into each data point in this study, which is essentially an individual person's recovery process, we'd find that in the people who recovered, there are massively different experiences among them in terms of what they found helpful in the treatment, what they could have done without, what had negative side effects. In the group of people who did not recover, there is also a multitude of different experiences that are implied but not reported on. So what were the challenges that got in the way? Why didn't treatment work for them? What were each of these people's past experiences? What were their family dynamics like? How did the treatment affect those family dynamics? What were they like when they left off? Were they better off, worse off, the same, in ways that were not measurable? So all of these are stories that are included in this research study but not told. And in research, we de-emphasize the anecdote or the individual person. But in clinical practice, as a clinician, that outlier, that anecdote might walk into my office. So when I hear a multitude of different individual stories, of individual anecdotes, I'm better equipped to stay with the person who enters my office, whatever their experience is, how whether it fits with what is evidence-based or the sort of scientific conclusions we've come to, or if it's not, or if they're the treatment resistant or the divergent in whatever way, individual or story. So when I engage with all of these different stories, with all of these different conversations, all of these people and their experiences, I become a better clinician, even if those experiences are not mainstream or generalizable, even if they're pure anecdote. Let's talk about creating a safe space. So in a space like this where we're having difficult conversations, obviously it's so important that people know that they won't be attacked for their positions, that people know it's safe to share whatever their experience is. Again, I really want to encourage the multitude of lived experience, that it can all be spoken. My promise is that I will approach each conversation with respect. I will not enter a conversation with the goal of convincing someone of anything, but only with the goal of understanding as best I can. If I have any reactions to what you are saying, I will do my best to share my reactions honestly and also take ownership that these are my reactions. I will not make any large scale truth claims, but only share what is happening for me so that we can connect through our differences. My request to you as the listener is please, please, please be respectful of whoever is speaking. If you engage with the content on this podcast in any way, it takes a lot of vulnerability to take a public stand on a controversial or unpopular position. Here, especially where I'm asking people to share not just their like intellectual viewpoints, but their personal experiences, their deeply held beliefs, it's really vulnerable, really risky, and very brave for people to come on here. So I'm just asking that as a listener, please respect that. Please be kind in your communication. And again, if you hear information that you believe is harmful, please reach out to me. And I'd love to have you on, or love to talk about having you as a podcast guest so that we can offer alternatives. So to summarize, the goal of ideology is to have kind, respectful conversations about controversial, emotionally charged issues in eating disorder recovery, about food, weight, body image, and all things related. And my goal here is to put our communication back in the context of the humanity of the person speaking and of our relationship with one another, to be able to have difficult conversations that bring us closer to each other rather than driving us apart, so that we can work together as a collective, become better human beings, better clinicians, better able to serve the diversity of human beings and human experiences that enter whatever treatment settings we work in. Thank you so much for joining, and I am looking forward to connecting more in future episodes.